Hey everyone, Elizabeth here. The Last Laugh delivers stories that leave you speechless. If you're here for it, hit subscribe and let's go.
The text came on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk on the 14th floor, reviewing a freight contract with a Port of Newark terminal operator, when my phone buzzed against the glass surface. I glanced at it the way you glance at anything reflexively without expectation. It was a family group chat message from my mother. That alone should have prepared me. It never did. Family Thanksgiving update. Marcus's parents are joining us this year, which is so exciting. Tyler's new wife Courtney has been working so hard on the seating and the menu and wants everything perfect. Just a heads up, Danielle, we're keeping it to a tighter group this time. Hope you have a great holiday wherever you end up. Love you. 3 exclamation points in the last sentence. My mother had always been talented at cruelty dressed in punctuation. I set the phone down. I went back to the freight contract. I initialed 3 pages and flagged a liability clause. Then my phone buzzed again. And again. And again. My Aunt Karen had replied with a red heart. My cousin Bethany, so excited for Courtney. She's been such an amazing addition to the family, smiling face with hearts. My cousin Derek, gonna be the best one yet. My Aunt Karen again. Danielle will understand, she's very independent. I read each one. I set the phone face down. I stared at the freight contract for approximately 45 seconds without reading a single word. Then I picked the phone back up, opened the thread and typed, "Understood." I hit send. I put the phone in my desk drawer. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. Not because crying would have been weakness, but because I think people assume that moments like that always break you in visible ways. They don't. Sometimes the impact is quieter. Sometimes you just sit in a very clean office on a Tuesday afternoon, and something that was already fragile in you gets a little more calcified, a little more permanent, and you file it away next to all the other things you've filed away and you go back to the freight contract. But I'll tell you what I did that night. I went home to my apartment, not the studio apartment CNN would later describe with a kind of breathless romanticism. I'd moved out of that one 4 years ago, and I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and my dog, a 7-year-old beagle named Cargo, with his head in my lap. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there. Cargo breathed slowly and I scratched his ears, and I thought about the first Thanksgiving I'd missed, which was 8 years ago, when I was 24 and couldn't afford the bus ticket home, and my mother had said, "Well, that's what happens when you make certain choices." I thought about the second one I'd missed when I'd been in Dallas closing our first major regional contract, and my brother Tyler had texted, "Mom says you couldn't make it again?" With no follow-up, no curiosity, just the faint suggestion that my absence was a pattern of selfishness. I thought about Courtney, whom I'd met exactly once at Tyler's wedding in June. She had looked at my business card, Danielle Reeves, founder and CEO Apex Freight Solutions, and said, "Oh, logistics. That's very practical." She'd said it the way someone says practical when they mean small. Tyler had laughed. I had smiled. I had put my card back in my clutch and gone to find the open bar. That was the last time I'd been in a room with my family. Now I sat on my kitchen floor and I looked at Cargo, and I thought about all the energy I'd spent over the years trying to make myself legible to people who had already decided what I was. And I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that comes with a speech or a moment of clarity soundtracked by swelling music. Just a quiet one. The kind that settles in your chest like something finally set down. I was done explaining myself. The thing about Apex Freight Solutions is that it wasn't supposed to be what it became. I want to tell this part carefully because the internet has a way of turning origin stories into myth, and I'm not interested in myth. I'm interested in what actually happened. I graduated from Rutgers with a degree in supply chain management in 2013, which is an unsexy degree that my mother described to relatives as something with shipping. I took a junior operations role at a mid-size logistics firm in Newark called Hartfield Carriers. I made $38,000 a year. I lived in a studio apartment in Kearney with a window that faced a parking garage. I ate a lot of rice and beans and I did not resent it. I want to be clear about that too, because the narrative of the scrappy founder requires a certain performative suffering that I don't think is honest. I was fine. I was building something. What I noticed at Hartfield, and what nobody else seemed interested in noticing, was that the company was hemorrhaging money on last-mile delivery inefficiencies in the tri-state corridor. They were using a patchwork of regional subcontractors with no unified tracking, No data integration, no accountability structure. Shipments disappeared. Deadlines slipped. Clients complained and then quietly left. The operations director, a man named Gerald who had worked there for 22 years, shrugged it off as just how the industry works. I built a route optimization model in my off hours. In my studio apartment. At a folding table I'd bought from a church sale for $12. I showed it to Gerald. Gerald said it was interesting and put it in a folder. I showed it to the regional VP. The regional VP said logistics was a relationship business and models don't close deals. I spent 6 months trying to find someone inside Hartfield who would let me pilot the system on a single route. Nobody would. So I left. I left with no clients, no capital, and a model that I believed in so completely that it frightened me a little. I applied for a small business loan and got rejected twice. I maxed out one credit card and opened another. My mother called during this period and I made the mistake of telling her what I was doing. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Danielle, your brother just got promoted to associate director. You know, there's no shame in working for someone else." I said, "I know, Mom." I found Marcus Webb at a supply chain conference in Philadelphia in 2015. He was presenting a paper on port integration data that aligned almost perfectly with the gap my model was designed to address. He was 31, serious, and deeply skeptical of everything I said for the first 45 minutes of our conversation. Then I showed him the model on my laptop in a hotel lobby, and he got very quiet in the specific way that serious people get quiet when they see something that changes their thinking. He called me the next morning. He said, "I want in." Marcus became my suit. He also became the person who has seen me at my absolute worst. Exhausted, furious, occasionally irrational, sometimes wrong, and who has never once used it against me. He was at my side when we landed our first regional contract with a pharmaceutical distributor in 2016. He was there when we expanded into temperature-controlled freight in 2018. He was there 3 years later when Apex Freight Solutions crossed $50 million in annual revenue and I sat in my office and laughed until I cried because I genuinely hadn't known if we'd make it. He was also the person I called from my kitchen floor the morning after my mother's Thanksgiving text. I hadn't planned to call him. I'd planned to handle it alone the way I handled most things involving my family. But at 7 in the morning, sitting on the floor with cargo still pressed against my leg, I dialed his number without really deciding to. He answered on the second ring. I told him what the text said. I read him the family thread. I told him about Courtney and the word practical at Tyler's wedding. I told him about the first Thanksgiving I'd missed and the second one and the third. I told him about my mother's voice when she'd said there's no shame in working for someone else, as if I had been the one who needed reassurance. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said, "You know the Ashford deal closes this week." I said, "I know." He said, "You're going to be on CNN, Danny." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you okay?" I looked at cargo. I thought about how to answer honestly. "Not entirely," I said. "But I will be." The Ashford Global acquisition had been 18 months in the making. Ashford Global Logistics was a publicly traded freight and supply chain management firm with operations in 14 countries and annual revenues of approximately $800 million. They were enormous. We were not. But what Apex had, and what Ashford's board had spent 2 years trying to build internally without success, was our routing intelligence platform, which by 2023 had processed over 40 million freight transactions and had a predictive accuracy rate that no competitor had come close to matching. Ashford's CEO, a woman named Patricia Chin who had built her own career in logistics over 30 years and who I respected more than almost anyone in the industry, had approached Marcus at a conference in Chicago 14 months ago. She'd said she wanted to talk about a strategic partnership. 6 weeks later, in a private meeting in Midtown Manhattan, she'd looked at our platform metrics and said she wasn't interested in a partnership. She wanted to acquire us. The negotiation had been, in the polite language of business journalism, complex. In the honest language of lived experience, it had been brutal. There were months where the deal seemed dead. There were weeks where I wasn't sleeping more than 4 hours a night. There was one specific Tuesday in March when our lead attorney called me at 10 p.m. to tell me that Ashford's board had rejected our final valuation ask, and I had stood in my office bathroom, gripped both sides of the sink, and talked myself out of calling the whole thing off. But Patricia Chin was serious. And her board, once they understood what our platform could do to their international operations, got serious too. The deal closed on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. $160 million. Marcus and I had shaken hands with Patricia in a conference room in Midtown and then walked outside into cold November air and stood on the sidewalk for a long time without saying anything. Then Marcus had said, "Your mom texted yesterday, right?" I had laughed so hard that a man passing with a coffee cup looked at me with genuine concern. The acquisition was embargoed until Ashford's official press release, scheduled for Thanksgiving Day. A strategic choice by Ashford's communications team, who wanted maximum media coverage during the holiday news cycle. Patricia had warned me, "You're going to be the story. Get ready." I had nodded and thought privately that I wasn't sure I was ready at all. Not for the story they were going to tell. Not for what it would mean when people I'd kept at a distance my whole professional life suddenly saw the version of me I'd been building quietly for a decade. Not for what it would mean when my family saw it. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early. I made coffee. I took cargo for a long walk through Riverside Park, where the trees had gone bare and the Hudson was gray and cold and beautiful in the way that November rivers are beautiful. A woman walking a golden retriever recognized cargo's breed and stopped to compare notes on beagle behavior for 10 minutes. We talked about stubbornness and howling and the specific genius of a dog who knows exactly what he's doing wrong and does it anyway. It was the best conversation I had all day, and I mean that without bitterness. I mean it as a fact about what matters. I came home and made eggs. I video called my friend Priya, who was spending Thanksgiving with her husband's family in Austin and who had been my closest friend since we'd met in a Rutgers supply chain seminar in 2011. Priya knew everything. The deal, the text, the kitchen floor moment, all of it. She answered the call wearing an apron that said "Base the Bird" and immediately said, "They're going to lose their minds today." I said, "Let's talk about something else." We talked for an hour about her daughter's first steps, which had happened the previous week, and about the Austin housing market, and about a show we'd both been watching. At no point did either of us talk about my family. It was one of the most grounding hours I'd had in months. At noon, I put on a cashmere sweater and took myself to dinner. Not a sad solo at a diner kind of dinner. I want to be precise here. Patricia Chin had invited me and Marcus and our respective teams to a private Thanksgiving dinner at her home in Greenwich, Connecticut. Her house was large and warm and full of people who worked in logistics and finance and who talked about things I found genuinely interesting. Patricia's husband made a turkey that I'm not exaggerating when I say was the best thing I'd ever eaten. Marcus brought his fiancée, a pediatric nurse named Simone who laughed easily and who gripped Marcus's arm when Patricia stood up to make a toast and said, "To the two people who built something so good that we had to have it." I held my glass and I smiled and I felt genuinely happy. I also felt underneath that something else, something I couldn't quite name and didn't try to. Kind of waiting. Because I knew what was happening 4 hours south of Greenwich in my mother's house in Metuchen, New Jersey, where the television was probably on, and the table was probably set, and Tyler's new wife Courtney was probably overseeing place cards with the focused intensity she applied to things she considered beneath her. At 3:47 p.m., Ashford Global's press release went live. At 3:48 p.m. CNN picked it up. I know the timing because Patricia's daughter, a 20-year-old home from college, was watching CNN on a tablet in the living room and she said loudly from the couch, "Oh wow, someone just sold their company for $160 million. Patricia looked at me. Marcus looked at me. I looked at my plate. "That's us," I said. Here is what I know about what happened in my mother's house because Tyler told me most of it later. In pieces over several phone calls, in the stilted, halting way that men in my family communicate anything that matters. They were at the table. Turkey had been carved. Courtney had made a sweet potato dish that she described as a recipe from my grandmother, who was very serious about Thanksgiving. My Aunt Karen was there and my Uncle Pete and my cousins Bethany and Derek. Tyler's college roommate and his wife had been invited as well, to balance the table and because Courtney liked them. The television in the living room was on. My mother always kept it on during holidays. Background noise she called it, though I think it was more that silence in our family had always felt dangerous. Tyler was in the middle of a story about a work trip to Phoenix when Derek glanced toward the living room and said, "Hey, is that?" The CNN banner read, $160 million acquisition. Meet the CEO who built a logistics empire from her studio apartment. My photo was on the screen. My professional headshot, the one my communications director had taken last year, where I'm wearing the gray blazer and my expression is the particular kind of calm that you learn to perform when people are going to look at you closely, filled the right third of the broadcast frame. The anchor was saying something about the tri-state logistics corridor and disruptive technology and a 10-year overnight success story. Tyler dropped his fork. My mother, according to Tyler, said nothing for a very long time. He stared at the screen. Then she turned to look at Tyler, and Tyler said her expression was one he'd never seen on her before. Not anger, not pride, but something closer to a person realizing that they've been standing in a room they thought they understood and finding out the walls are different than they believed. Courtney said, "Who is that?" Tyler said, "That's my sister." Courtney said, "Your sister is a CO?" Tyler said, "Apparently." My Aunt Karen made a sound. Derek pulled out his phone. Bethany said, "Oh my God," and then said it again quieter. The anchor continued. The segment was 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I've watched it since, the way you watch something that happened to someone who is you but also somehow separate from you. The anchor talked about Apex Freight Solutions and the routing platform and the Ashford deal and then said, Reeves, who founded the company at 25 with a credit card and a model she built at a folding table in her apartment, declined to comment on what the acquisition means for her personally. But sources close to the deal say she's been offered a senior leadership role at Ashford Global, overseeing the integration of her platform across their international operations. Courtney said something after that, according to Tyler. "You wouldn't tell me exactly what it was." He said, "It wasn't good, Danny." My mother told him to clear the plates. Nobody moved. My phone started ringing at 4:02 p.m. I was still at Patricia's table, where Marcus had poured more wine and someone had brought out pie and the conversation had moved to holiday travel, and my phone was buzzing in my blazer pocket with the specific relentlessness of something that isn't going to stop. I excused myself and went into the hallway. Tyler had called 4 times. My Aunt Karen had called twice. My cousin Bethany had sent 8 text messages in 8 minutes, escalating from "Danny?" to "Danny, please call me," to "Okay, I'm freaking out a little." My mother had not called. My mother had not texted. I stood in Patricia Chen's hallway looking at my phone screen and I made a deliberate choice. I called Tyler back. He answered immediately. "Danny," he said, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard in years, maybe ever. Something stripped of the careful neutrality he'd maintained toward me for most of our adult lives. He sounded genuinely undone. "Danny, why didn't you tell us?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. Would it have changed anything? I said. He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said. And then, "I should have called you. About the Thanksgiving thing. I should have. Courtney wanted, I should have called." I listened to him not quite apologize. I'd had a lot of practice at this, listening to the half apologies of people who felt badly but not quite badly enough to take full responsibility for the thing they'd done. Tyler was not a cruel person. I want to be honest about that too. He was a person who had chosen consistently over many years the path of least resistance, and that path ran straight through me. He wasn't malicious. He was convenient, and I had never fully figured out which was worse. "Tyler," I said, "I need you to understand something. I didn't hide this from the family to make a point. I wasn't setting anything up. I was just living my life, building my company, not explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was." He said, "I know." "I don't think you do," I said. "Not yet." I told him I'd call him next week. I meant it, not warmly, not with the performed closeness that had always felt dishonest between us, but genuinely. I would call him. We would figure out what, if anything, was left to figure out. I hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, my back against the wall, the sound of other people's easy holiday conversation drifting from the dining room. My mother still hadn't called. I thought about calling her. I held the phone in my hand and thought about dialing her number and thought about what I would say and more importantly what she would say and more importantly what she would not say, the apology that would be too small for what it was carrying, or the defensiveness that would reframe her cruelty as concern, the way she'd always been able to. I put the phone back in my pocket. I went back to the table. Marcus raised an eyebrow. I shook my head slightly, "Not now," and he nodded and poured me more wine and someone said something that made everyone laugh and I laughed too genuinely because I was surrounded by people who had chosen me on purpose, who knew what I'd built and had helped me build it, and the pie was extraordinary and cargo was at home waiting for me and the Hudson was still gray and cold outside and would be there in the morning. My mother called at 11:14 p.m. I was home by then, sitting on the couch with cargo pressed against my side and a book open in my lap that I hadn't been reading. I looked at the phone screen. I let it ring. Not out of cruelty, I want to be precise about this, but because I knew that whatever she had to say, I wasn't ready to receive it at 11:14 p.m. on Thanksgiving night, when the wine had worn off and the distance between what I'd accomplished and what my family had made me feel about myself was more nakedly obvious than usual. I sent her to voicemail. I would call her back. I would have a conversation that would be hard and partial and probably unsatisfying in the specific way that conversations with your mother about years of accumulated damage are always unsatisfying. We would not have a breakthrough. There would be no scene where she fully understood what she'd done and I fully forgave her and we started fresh. I was 32 years old and I had stopped believing in those scenes somewhere around the second Thanksgiving I'd missed. But we would talk. Because she was my mother. And because I had not, despite everything, stopped caring about that. And because the part of me that still showed up, the part that had sat on the kitchen floor with cargo when the group thread gutted me, the part that had answered Tyler's call instead of ignoring it, was also the part that was going to have to live with whatever I chose next. In the weeks that followed, 3 things happened that I will tell you honestly and without embellishment. The first, Tyler called me on a Saturday in December without Courtney in the background and said he wanted to have lunch. We met at a restaurant in Hoboken that was neutral ground for both of us. Not our mother's neighborhood, not mine. He arrived before me and was already sitting when I came in and he looked, I thought, smaller somehow. Not physically. Tyler was still 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered, but in the way that people look when the story they've been telling themselves has been revised without warning. We ate for a while without saying anything important. Then he said, Courtney didn't know. About how she'd been with you. I didn't explain it properly. I said, Tyler. You knew. He set down his fork. Yeah, he said. I did. That was as close to an accounting as I got from him that day. It wasn't enough. I don't know if there isn't enough for 12 years of watching your brother choose not to intervene. But it was true and it was said directly, and after years of careful evasion from him, it landed differently than I expected. I didn't forgive him in that lunch. I don't think forgiveness is a switch. But I put him in a different category than I'd had him in before. Not absolved but present. Trying. We've had lunch twice since. I don't know what we are to each other now. I think we're figuring it out. The second thing. Courtney sent me a text message in December that I've read enough times to have memorized. Tyler told me more about the family history. I want to say that I didn't understand what I was asking when I asked for you not to be included for Thanksgiving. I'm not going to pretend I didn't mean what I meant about wanting things a certain way. I did mean it and that was wrong. I'm sorry. It was a careful message. It didn't fully fall on the sword. But I recognized in it the particular effort of someone who comes from a background where apology is unusual and who'd had to talk herself into writing each sentence. I texted back, I appreciate you saying this. I meant it. We are not close. We may never be. But I think the table has more chairs than it did before and I think she knows it. The third thing, my mother came to my office. She didn't call ahead. She arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-December, told my receptionist she was Danielle Reeves's mother, and sat in the lobby for 25 minutes while I finished a call with Patricia Chen's integration team. When I came out and saw her in the chair, small in her good winter coat, her hands in her lap, something moved through my chest that I can't precisely name. Not forgiveness. Not anger exactly. Something older and more complicated. I brought her back to my office. She sat across from my desk and she looked around at the framed contracts on the wall and the view of Newark and the model I keep on my shelf. A small plastic freight container that Marcus gave me when we hit $10 million in revenue as a joke that became a talisman, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, I didn't know you were doing all this. I said, I know you didn't. She said, I should have asked. I said, yes. She said, I was embarrassed by you. I'm ashamed of that now. I sat with that for a moment. It was the most honest thing my mother had said to me in years, possibly ever. I thought about whether to tell her how much had been lost in the accumulation of small exclusions, of heart reacts to messages that cut me, of a lifetime of being the daughter who didn't fit the story she wanted to tell. I thought about whether to tell her that being seen now only because CNN had said a number, was its own kind of wound. I decided to tell her the truth. Mom, I said, I need you to understand that being proud of me because I sold a company for $160 million is not the same as knowing me. And I've spent a long time trying to be known by people in this family. I'm a little tired. She looked at her hands. I know, she said. We sat together for a while after that. I made her coffee. She asked about Cargo. She'd always liked Cargo, one of the few constants between us. And I showed her a recent photo of him, ridiculous as ever, wearing a Halloween costume Priya had bought him. She laughed. It wasn't a reconciliation. I wanted to be honest about that. When she left, I stood at my office window and watched her walk to her car in the parking structure across the street. And I felt the specific grief of understanding that some damage is not undone, only managed. That you can love people and be deeply harmed by them, and neither of those things cancels the other out. I thought about the text she'd sent in November. Your brother's wife says you'd kill the vibe. The heart reacts from relatives who'd watched me be dismissed for years and found it convenient to agree. The way my own family had required a dollar figure on a Chiran to take my life seriously. I thought about Marcus in that Philadelphia hotel lobby, leaning over my laptop, going quiet in the way of someone whose thinking was changing. I thought about Priya in an Austin kitchen with an apron and a laughing face, and 12 years of friendship that had never once required me to justify myself. I thought about Cargo waiting at home, blameless. I turned away from the window. I went back to work.